So welcome, my name is Alicia Stewart, and welcome to the talk show with Alicia Stewart. And I have my esteemed guest here, Turner Trice, who is quite the famous journalist in Chicago. She's been working for the Chicago Tribune for many years, and we're just going to get to know her a little bit. Dawn, tell me how you got started at the Chicago Tribune. What's been your story of your career there?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for being here, and thank you guys for coming. I started out at the Tribune as an editor, and I spent a few years running a bureau. And after that, I wrote a novel, and then another novel. And the publisher at the time, Jack Fuller, read the novel and said, well, why is she editing? She should be writing. And I started my column in the year 2001. It was a few months before September 11th. And I have been writing the column at the Tribune since then, and I've been writing enterprise stories. These are longer stories that take a little bit more time, and they're thoughtful. You guys know this, right? Longer page one type stories. So I do a combination of things.
Fantastic. I mean, it sounds like a pretty eclectic career. You get a little bit of everything. You get the column, you get the reported pieces, you've been an editor. How did you even get into the business in the first place?
I started in college as a pre-med student, and I had to, I still love to this day science and math, but I had to make the drive home to my parents to tell them that I didn't want to be a doctor, I wanted to be a writer. And our compromise was that I would have a job in which I could make some money. And that was journalism. Because the notion of being a writer, just to my parents, they saw poverty. And they wanted me to be self-sufficient and to leave their home at some point. So journalism was it for me. I worked for a year at the Orlando Sentinel. Is there anybody here from Florida? I know most of you come from the Northeast. Anybody from Florida? Okay. I'm not a fan of Florida because I like the seasons. Now, this year in Boston has kind of tempered that this winter, but I do love having seasons. So I spent a year in Orlando. I did an internship in New York, did something in LA, and then wound up making my way back to Chicago, which is where my family is.
I'm from Chicago too, and I got to tell you, those winters can get pretty harsh.
Absolutely.
And speaking of harsh, I'm really curious, besides kind of convincing your parents that you were going from pre-med to the very lucrative career of writing, what's been your toughest kind of encounter or interview when you've encountered all these different subjects over the years and you're reporting or editing or column writing?
Right. There are a couple of interviews that spring to mind. One is an interview with a woman that it took me 2 years to get. And it was a matter of, and it wasn't that she was not a celebrity or a politician or public figure. She was just a woman who was just very, very difficult to get in contact with, which was one thing. She had no phone. And she was older, and her story was, the story was about her learning that she was not an American citizen when she was maybe in her late 80s. So it was just very difficult to get in touch with her. And it was the persistence, and I finally got that story, and it really went internationally. It made international news. And the second...
Why do you think it resonated internationally?
Because we were talking at the time about immigration. And when we talk about the immigration debate, it often tends to be very narrowly focused on people who are coming from Mexico or from some other, from some country that kind of falls under that umbrella. This was a woman who had Irish ancestry. And she had come to this country as a child. Maybe she was about, I think, 2 or 3 years old. And she had come through Ellis Island, but no one ever had, she never had the right documentation. And she had lived here for decades and never had the right documentation. And didn't find that out until she had to take care of her grandkids. And she applied for public assistance. And then they needed information from her, and she didn't have it. And that's when she learned that she was not a citizen.
That's incredible. I mean, I would imagine that part of the reason why it was so hard wasn't just the phone, but just somebody sharing that kind of sensitive information with you must have been really delicate. How did you convince her finally?
Yeah, it's very difficult when you're dealing with people who are not media savvy, right? I mean, on one hand, we deal with a lot of people who want to direct the interview. They want to control their, the narrative. But when you're dealing with people who don't have a lot of interactions with the media, you have to really help them feel comfortable. And I take that extremely seriously. So when I have come after someone who's not normally engaged with the media, I'm very careful about any story. But there's an extra level of care that I take with someone whom I've asked to tell their story, because they're entrusting me with information. And I stuck with her for probably maybe a month or so, because it wasn't just get in there, talk, and leave. I mean, I had to go through public records. I had to search for documents, and then go back to her and ask for context to understand the documents. So it was a challenging experience, but it was well worth it.
Yeah.
And I think that it resonated with readers because there was not just her story. So it wasn't just what she told me, but I talked to probably about 20 other people as well.
Okay. So, I can imagine that on the one hand, it's tough to kind of get people who aren't necessarily used to all the kind of media attention to open up. But then on the other hand, there's the very kind of astute politician or bureaucratic administrator. Let's say some of you guys might have known those from your schools, right? How do you deal with someone who lies to you or isn't really telling you the whole truth?
Oh, absolutely. And people who even stonewall, they won't return your calls. Or they talk to you, but they speak in half-truths. Or they won't, they'll say something is off the record, and you need to get them back on the record. There are several ways to do it. I wrote a story about, a story in which I needed the Chicago Police Department to talk to me on the record. And the PR person did not want to talk. And so I said, well, I can get these numbers, I can get the statistics from somebody else. And so I went and got them. And I said, well, okay, are these numbers correct? And at that point, he had to engage because he did not want someone else to show them up. And I also say that, listen, I am trying to do my job. And in order for me to do my job, I mean, this has to be fair, it has to be accurate, and so I need you to talk to me. And I will call and call and call. And if we cannot engage, then I will include a line in the story that says, they wouldn't talk, that says something like the so-and-so declined to comment.
So, I mean, that's a case of when somebody doesn't even talk to you until you kind of force them to.
Right.
But have you ever had anyone kind of straight up lie to you or
Absolutely.
Mislead you?
Yes. And in those, that's a really good question because it really gets to the heart of what we do. I mean, people will talk to us, and depending on who they are, everybody has an agenda, right? We all have an agenda. And so, but it is our job as reporters, as editors too, to check everything and make sure that, even if someone says, oh, it's Madison Street rather than Madison Avenue, we have to, that sounds small, but that makes a big deal because our credibility is always on the line. And readers will assume if you will skimp on something little like that, and if they can't trust you to tell, to give these types of details and make sure that they're correct, then how can they trust you with the bigger details?
Absolutely. Speaking of bigger details and bigger stories, you seem to kind of have a theme in your career. And if you don't mind, I've taken the liberty of picking out some of your favorite stories, and can we just kind of talk about them?
Absolutely.
There was a story that you did that was pretty personal that we have up here. Can you tell us a little bit about the story? And I'll scroll through the 2 pages if you can just talk us through it.
Sure. This is a story that I did in 2007 about a childhood friend. We grew up together, and there's me, there's my friend Deborah, and we grew up together in this middle-class community in Chicago, and we really started out at virtually the same place. We were going to grow up and be doctors, but our paths diverged, and she started using drugs, and she wound up murdering a man. And she was 32 years old and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. And so I wanted to tell a story about a person who had, she doesn't have the background that the stereotypical background that we normally hear when we're talking about people who are in the prison system. And she had both parents. They intervened. They advocated for her, and still her life went off the rails. But the story that I wrote was how she found herself in prison, and how she got a second. That's her at her debutante ball. But how I wanted to tell a story about how redemption is possible at any stage. And that was, she graduated from college in prison. And that was that story. And it really, it was widely read.
Mm. And how was that for you? Interviewing someone you've known since you were a child.
It's very difficult. And one of the things that you have to do is that, memory is fluid and fuzzy. And so you still have to check everything, right? So I interviewed her, and it wasn't just the story of the two of us. I had to interview prison officials. I talked to the family of the person, of her victim. So it was, it's still not a single source story. It reads sometimes like, so I don't attribute everything to everybody, but I had to check everything. So if there's a number in there, or if there's a detail in there then a lot of them were checked. I was just looking for, trying to find something that may, that kind of seems a little innocuous, but there really isn't anything that's innocuous in a story.
Yep, the level of detail, how far the facility was from, the middle of a cornfield, the way you kind of paint these pictures really shows like how you had to go the extra mile with beyond the memories that you knew to the reporting that you
And so there are 159 women in Rockville serving sentences greater than 20 years. Somebody told me that, right? That's not something that I could just, kind of define.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a fascinating story because it had a personal tie, but you also, talk about the historical ties, these larger kind of stories that take us through a period of history. Can you talk about this story, Chicagoans and the Dream?
Right. One of the things that we should keep in mind when we get a story, we think about, how do I tell it? So this is before the interviewing starts. So how can I tell a story that's basically, everybody, we've heard of the March on Washington. And we've heard, and typically they're like the storehouse of people that we go to all the time. And one of the things that I try to do is find people whom we haven't heard from. People who have these really interesting stories that are fresh and new. And so I found several people who went to the March on Washington, and we'd never heard from them before. And their stories, the things that they told us. There was a white woman who had started like the first African American studies group or something at a high school in Chicago, and she was like one of just a handful of white kids in this group. So the whole idea of finding different people, and then I decided that I started to write it, and then I realized I needed to get out of the way. Their voices were amazing, so what I did was write a little lead-in, and then I did it kind of in a narrative style, so that they were speaking to us. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that seems like it's easy, but it's difficult to get the cadence of the voice, and also, and the other thing is that you have to check that too, because some of these people, well, all of them, they were older and they were far removed from that day. So you have to go back and make sure that their memory of the event is actually accurate.
It's such an art and a science, right?
Yeah,
just to kind of figure out both of those.
Right.
Both of those stories had such different kind of nuances and things that you had to bring to it, and to double check and to report. It's probably a delicate ask sometimes to have people, check their memories because it becomes so strong in your mind. How do you handle that?
I did it the way I would do just to continue the interview. Mm-hmm. I would say, okay, I checked this, mm-hmm. but these dates don't line up, too well. So what, I mean, could you have been mistaken? And they're like, oh, that's probably, maybe I didn't remember it correctly. So I think that a lot of times clearly we are not friends with our sources, but we can act and treat people with respect so the curiosity is real and it's genuine. And when you treat people in a respectful way, they're willing to, go over and over. And I tell you, I do this all the time. I will call 5 times if I'm not, just to make sure that what I've heard, did you say 50, 50, or 15, 15, right? I mean, that statistic that you gave me, it just doesn't jive with what the Pew Center is saying. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's totally okay to call back and go back and forth with people, because you would much rather do it now than have somebody point out an inaccuracy in the newspaper.
I mean, clarity, obviously,
Absolutely.
And accuracy is so keen to our profession. Right. Can you tell me a little bit about this story, which you touched on earlier?
Yeah, don't you love that face? I love that face. I mean, this is Josephine Stout, and we call the story An American Odyssey because she just really started in one place, and it wasn't the physical movement, but it is the whole idea that you can believe you belong somewhere and you're rooted, and you are, in a sense, but legally you are not. And that was the story that was the story that we talked about earlier about Josephine and her very particular immigration story.
Wow, what a fascinating body of work. And you're so fascinating in the way I think you kind of approach different stories and think about the way in which journalism can illuminate individuals' lives. Thank you so much for being on our show today, Dawn, and thank you, audience, for being here. We really appreciate hearing more about your story.
My pleasure. Okay. So you guys can see what we're doing here, right? So Alicia.
Hi.
It's very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. What's your name?
I am Dawn Turner Trice.
It's nice to meet you, Dawn.
This is the Dawn Turner Trice Show. It's a pleasure to meet you, Alicia. And let's talk about, you've had this illustrious career in broadcast. And and so I want to start with your background and how you came to television.
Goodness, that's a big question. So I'll start at the beginning. I started out really interested in the sciences, in psychology and biology. I always loved to read, always was reading. Was a little bit shy, but always enjoyed observing people and just kind of enjoying human behavior and interaction. And so for a psychology project in high school, I actually kind of was a little bit of an overachiever, a lot of an overachiever, and did a whole television show. So I had been working on the school newspaper and also at our local television station, and just decided to make a whole little talk show for my psychology class. And it was, it's a little bit, but and where I got it from, I don't know, but I probably from my parents to some degree, but also because I think I was just really curious and really eager to try to hear from different people and really understand different worlds from a very young age. And so it never was something I necessarily thought of as a profession until I went to this journalism workshop. So I played basketball pretty competitively in high school, and I signed a letter of intent to go play in college, and I was off. I was going to do this thing and try to do it well. And I went, my aunt insisted that I sign up and apply for this journalism workshop. And I went the summer before my freshman year of college, and it changed my life. Mm-hmm. So I was working for a radio station. I'd never worked with radio before. It was completely new to me. Had never, really put together a radio story before. And it was so hard. It was super duper hard. We were up all night. We were trying to talk to people that wouldn't talk to us. I did this hard-hitting story about women who smoke. It was such a serious investigation. And I say that facetiously. And it was just really a huge opportunity for me to kind of dig in and really try to do something on deadline and just love every minute of it, no matter how hard it got and no matter how many challenges it was. I saw it as a creative challenge and a fun challenge. And it really kind of like changed the course of what I thought I would be doing with my life. And I marched into that admissions office. I had already been accepted to the school where the journalism workshop was, which just happened to be the best school of journalism in the world, the University of Missouri. I was able to talk her into. And this is like actually backed up by studies. Let me just say, it's not just my opinion. Was able to kind of figure out the scholarship that I had turned down to get it there. I had gotten an academic scholarship there. And, it worked out. I ended up, changing it, did something that was not characteristic of me, which was like, renege on an offer that I really had, took very seriously. It was for one of the first times I think I'd done that in my like young life. But it was also the right thing to do. And I had very understanding parents, very supportive parents. And it really just kind of like opened up whole new worlds for me. I started working at the local radio station. As soon as I got to school, I started working for an NPR affiliate, KBIA 91.3 FM, your NPR station, and also for this children's television show at the local NBC affiliate. So that's how I kind of got my start in broadcast. And from there, it's just been a huge journey. I worked pretty much throughout my whole time in undergrad. I went to Puerto Rico, which also like opened up new worlds and just new experiences and new ideas. And then we had an inaugural summer program in New York City. The University of Missouri was having. I really wanted to get out of the Midwest at that point for a lot of reasons. I went to New York. Now, let me be clear, I was not the girl who wanted to always go to New York. In fact, I pretty much hated New York the first couple of years I was there, but at that time it was a good start. I never intended on moving there. And during that summer program, in 2 weeks, my internship at ABC News Productions turned into a job. And so I had the very kind of unlikely start and had a fantastic career in New York City. Working in documentaries, working in news, working in women's programming, and most recently, the largest part of my career, most recently was at CNN, where at the height was in broadcast, I was a senior producer for the In America unit, which is the documentary unit that did education in America, minors in America, Black in America, Latino in America, with Soledad O'Brien. So it's been a varied and just, career full of adventure.
Well, let me just say that I'm very happy that you took that path, because if you hadn't, maybe you wouldn't be here with us today.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Cool. I would love to know how you prepare for an interview, and is it any different if you're writing something or if it's for a documentary, so talk a little bit about that.
No, I think that's a really important point. So, most recently in my career, I made the full deep dive into digital. I always kind of been like flirting with it a little bit. I'd been working in new media, kind of picking that up. But most recently in my career, I was an editor of a blog that grew out of that In America documentary unit I mentioned. And it was just a good opportunity to delve deep in the kind of future of news and where it's going within digital. And so, it really allowed me to think about like what works in preparation for an interview in the digital space and what works within the broadcast space. But, for both, what is similar and what is the same is absolutely, I try to read everything I can about the person. Normally, time doesn't always allow for that, but I'm pretty anal when it comes to like trying to find everything and the things that they don't think I will find. And it's not just reading it and absorbing it for the information.
And Alicia, is this via Google? So do you
No,
Google,
it's LexisNexis, it's Google, maybe a start, but everything kind of is a deeper hole to some more research, So I'll give an example with Jeremy Lin. So Jeremy Lin, I was totally Linsane, I will say that on the record. And I was so curious. Jeremy Lin, who like went off and just, don't look at me started. So he worked, at the time he was at the New York Knicks, I was in New York. Everybody was just like into New York Knicks, like history, just like into the games. He was winning games. He just kind of came out of nowhere, Harvard grad. And he was just not, shall we say, who people expected to be the basketball star. And, his story really kind of like spoke to that in many different ways. He was a person of faith who spoke openly about his Christianity. He was an Asian American male who talked about, what it was like to kind of be denied opportunities, even though he was this like amazing basketball player, because people didn't see him as that. So, clearly I had been reading everything, but I had to take it to another level. So,
how did you do that, Alicia?
How I did that is there was a documentary that was being done about him, and I didn't know the filmmakers directly, but since I had the background in documentaries, documentaries go like super deep into their history, obviously, in doing that. So I was able to not just read what the documentary people were doing on their Facebook page, but like talk to different people who were around that. Every article is like I said, brings more information. So his mom is from Taiwan. What was her story coming? Right. What hasn't he said? What are the themes in the research I'm reading? Just basically going just to see what has he been saying and what is he telling us about us, and what are the questions that aren't being asked. Sure. And what is being assumed. Mm-hmm. So I'm more so not just reading for knowledge, but reading for what I don't know and what are the questions that come up.
And I'm wondering, so you come with so you've done the research, mm-hmm. extensive research, mm-hmm. and then I'm wondering, are there times during the interview when something may come up?
Absolutely. I think that, just to kind of cut to the chase and stop harping on Lynn for a minute, I think that what
Jeremy's crushing.
That's so embarrassing. So I think that it's like this dedication to doing as much research as you can, knowing as much as you can, but right. then the humility to recognize that you really don't know this person, and you need to be open to who they reveal themselves to be or who they want to tell you they are. So it's this very kind of constant line you tread, whether it's digital, absolutely, it's an art. Between this kind of like professed knowledge and research, the science of that, but then the opportunity to be surprised. And that's what I love. And so just to answer your question succinctly, the difference I think between broadcast and digital is really broadcast, you have to be concerned about the visuals. You need to be concerned if it's going to be a video, you can talk about it and show something basically. And if you're asking questions, like if I'm on air as the interviewer, I need to make sure that question incorporates information that, you coming to the story might not know about. I might be obsessed with all those stats, but they might not know that. So incorporating that into the question and not assuming everybody knows what you know, and being a proxy, in essence, for the reader or for the viewer.
Absolutely. Talk about one of your most difficult or sensitive interviews.
Oh, goodness. One, I don't think I can talk about, but I can tell a quick story. Goodness, difficult is so subjective. Okay, so I'll give one example. So difficult in getting an interview. Gloria Stefan was doing a tour. It was something publicity related. So just getting that interview, it's like you can work for. I worked for CNN, as I mentioned, when I was getting this particular interview, and you can work for huge outfits. I mean, you can work for huge organizations, and it does not. You still have to do the work. You still have to, particularly with people who are well known, or particularly with people who. Everybody's trying to interview. And it was just, her people were just really, they didn't know me, I'm not Soledad, I'm not like a name, and so it was just a lot of persistence, to 4 different people in her camp, quite frankly, using my connections, calling again. So that was difficult in that essence. Once I had the interview, they were like, oh, you're great. We want you to come back and interview all the time, but it just took a lot to get it. Yeah. A difficult kind of emotional interview was one of my first interviews when I was probably about you all's age. I was working at a local television station, and I was an on-air reporter at the time. There was a murder of a young woman outside of Kansas City, and the parents, the family wasn't talking to anybody. And they were willing to talk to me after some cajoling and delicate diplomatic persistence. And it was a really shady situation. It was really shady. It was very fresh. I mean, their grief was just palpable. I mean, it was just palpable. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps like remembering it. But it was just really emotionally difficult. And I think that was difficult in the ethical quandary. Like, how much am I going to push these people to share their pain, in this forum? And so, like, that was one of the first times I think it became real for me of like, okay, you are privileged to honor these people's stories. Like, at what cost are you going to do that,
Did you find yourself getting emotional, or have you ever gotten emotional?
I totally do. I think I have depending on the context, I try not to, I try to remain professional and human as well. I think that's important to remember you are human before you're a robotic journalist. But I think I've trained myself maybe not to show it in the, at the time, yes. Right? For many different reasons. I might put a hand on someone's shoulder. I'm not going to be like I said, not acknowledge something because I think that's just insincere, and it's not who I am. But I might not break down like I didn't break down in front of them at that moment, but maybe have a private moment with, when I return. But what I did learn too is, okay, so you might make that decision personally. I'm not going to exploit these people's pain. Or you might decide it's important for other people to see that so it won't happen. Right. Whatever you decide, I think it's important to remember you have an obligation. I mean, I personally feel an obligation for the values and the person I want to be, but also you have an obligation to your organization that has assigned you to get this story. So you have to come up with a solution or a compromise or something if you decide that's not going to work for you for a variety of reasons. Right. So that was difficult in that regard. The last example I'll give is I interviewed a famous person who shall remain nameless, horrible storyteller. I mean, like the worst, like would not finish a story, goes off in tangents, doesn't tell things. I mean, they think that they're great, which is the horrible thing about it.
Now, was this on camera or?
It was on camera. Yeah. It was on camera, and it was not only on camera. It was on camera, and it wasn't narrated. So they have to tell their own story, which makes it even more challenging. It's painful, and you ask questions different ways. You come back and ask them to repeat it. You try not to put words in their mouth and say, "Let's have a full sentence." It's challenging, though, so it was difficult in that way. So those are three, yeah. So there's three different examples, yeah.
So my last question is, how do you recover from a bad interview? Whether someone, and maybe it's not, and that's kind of, it sounds like you did have a bad interview with the one you just mentioned.
Well, so define bad. Is it bad in that they're...
It could be bad in any way. It could be bad in that people are not honest, or maybe they're not totally forthcoming. Maybe, or maybe it's, as you just said, someone who wanders, and
you never makes it to their destination.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. I think that it's not so much how I recover. It's like I feel like it's a creative challenge at the end of the day. Like it's frustrating and I'm upset about it. Yeah. Right. But I think that so for example, it's a creative challenge. So it forces you like deadlines and not getting the perfect interview or not having that person call you back or something offers an opportunity to be creative and do something else. So for example, if somebody doesn't talk to you, then interviewing everybody around them. If anybody saw the Out magazine did this interview, they wanted to have Beyonce, they had named her something, like the cover woman, but they couldn't get access to her because she's doing 50 million things. But she allowed them access to her team. So they interviewed everyone in her creative team for her company. So, it was a challenge. They didn't get to talk to her. They say that in the piece. But then they had this other interesting kind of insight to her life that they wouldn't have gotten by just talking to her. So, I think that recovery is really just being creative. Yeah. I'm not trying to sit home and cry about it too much anymore. Maybe initially, but you got to just deal with it.
Now, I know that you have some footage or some links.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of show some of those examples of what I've worked on, some that I've mentioned already. And, excuse me.
Actually, I'll get out of the way again.
No problem. All right, so we're going to start with one of my favorites is 5 questions for Jeremy Lin.
Hey, Jeremy Lin?
We'll go ahead and play. Well, I won't play this. I actually did the text. This is a text piece. And then we had a video piece that we produced to accompany it. So this was a series I did. There were several series that I did. One was called How I Got Here, which is basically like somebody who you think you know in the news, but just to kind of tell their story and tell their journey. So that was something I came up with. And that evolved into these kind of 5 questions. So kind of people of the week. Around identity, culture, and spirit, which is kind of like my beat throughout my career. So, like I said, I'm not interested in what I've read. I've tried to read everything. I'm not interested in what everybody else has said. So the news that broke, and this is he really talked about racism, which he had kind of skidded around in other kind of stories, but he's somebody who speaks very efficiently. He's like, yes, no, yeah, no, okay. He doesn't really expand, so that was the challenge. I talked to him. I got a 30-minute interview with him. I think I maybe asked him 33 questions in that interview because he has such short answers. So the challenge with him was getting him to have 3 sentences. This was an accomplishment. Like you don't see that art when you see the published piece of like what it took to get that out in a very short time.
Excellent.
So, and then, how do you trying to talk about like the kind of challenge? I'm always looking for like what is the tension point, right? So you're this extraordinarily competitive basketball player, and yet you have this profound faith that teaches humility, and teaches like collaboration and like how do you kind of like manage those two? So trying to find what that tension is in that person, and get them to talk about the things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise talk about.
Alicia, I'm wondering, did you have to ask? So when he would answer no to a question, would you?
Oh, I totally follow up.
And
Absolutely.
then you would ask him to expand on it?
No, I would
you
word
just
it in
follow-
a different
yeah.
way. I would ask a different question and maybe come back around to
Right.
it. Just depending, like you really have to rely upon your experience and instinct after a while to try to determine in the moment what's best, because sometimes people are resistant for a reason, and it's better to let it go and come back later.
Right, and sometimes people are nervous, a little nervous
Right.
early on. And so it takes maybe 15 minutes or so into the interview before they warm up. And I don't know that was Jeremy's case, but sometimes that happens.
So that was Jeremy Lin. And then I mentioned Gloria Stefan. Gloria Stefan is lovely, and a lot of people know her. She has a huge amount of fans. She tells the same stories to every person she interviews. So and this is what happens when you talk to people who are well known. Obviously, they have their talking points. They're seasoned and they're trained. So my challenge was, one, to get the interview. As I mentioned, it was quite tough to just get it done, and then 2, just to kind of make her feel comfortable to share something she hadn't already shared. And, this was in person. This was a live interview. So we also have a video of her as well, where one of our anchors spoke to her on camera. But, just getting her, I was sitting down with her and Emilio, her husband and manager, and, was able to kind of extract some things she hadn't said. What were we going to ask, Leah?
Sure. How often do you get questions that are off limits with VIPs?
I don't know. Like, I don't really like to believe that anything is off limits. So, there's some like bigger, maybe. There's sometimes larger kind of negotiations that go on. So, for example, how I finally got in is another colleague of mine was an editorial producer who had booked her first show. And so I kind of made myself part of that package. Like, you got to talk to me too. That's how I got this 30 minutes that I then expanded to an hour. So I think that depending on the higher level, it's not, people who are well known know that journalists' kind of credibility relies on not having things off limits, but maybe they'll negotiate to, this is what we'll cover. But nothing should ever really be off limits, I think, if you're going to do your due diligence. And if somebody tells you not to say, hey, you know what? I'm coming at you, you know what it means for my credibility, and just like you wouldn't want me to question whatever it is you do, this is mine. So you got to be open to that. Those are kind of the rules of the games. And you might make accommodations, not necessarily with not asking a question, but like, we'll keep it in this range of subject matter. You know what I mean? But also, you guys should know this, which I assume you do. You should never like give your questions to the subject beforehand. Like that's, I don't know.
And nothing is, I mean, I go in saying that there's nothing off limits. Now, the person can say, I will not answer that, and I'll respect that.
Right.
I mean, I remember when Barack Obama was running for the U.S. Senate, I had lunch with him, and we were talking, and I'm like, and his handlers, and so they don't want, typically the subject does not want to be the one who says, oh, I can't answer, but the handlers will say, well, don't talk to him about,
right.
And I'm like, I've got to ask. Now, he may not answer, but I have to ask.
Right.
And that's something that's really important. And then at the end of it, it's okay with that person or anybody to say, is there something I have not asked you that that you want to talk about? Or, and I also, a little a wrinkle to that is, what is it that you can tell me that you haven't told anybody else?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great one.
And maybe you get something, maybe not, but I think it's a fair question to ask.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that's perfect. I mean, like the PR people are going to be the ones that try to shut it down before I mean, if they're big enough and they have, a team. Right.
Yeah.
So they're going to know the rules of the road. And like they said, people can always refuse to answer. And I've seen different people, colleagues, professionals do this quite delicately. So Leslie Stahl was interviewing Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's a very charming guy, regardless of what you think of his politics. Same can be said for, Bill Clinton. But in this interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger, she was basically, they were laughing, having a great time, going all over the world, going to his home place. And then the way they edited the piece, she was like, you're such a fun guy, but talk to me about what you've done with your wife. Like she did on his wife. Like she's got to ask this question, but she did it in such a maybe, like they have a familiarity that you can't ignore at this point. And, like he likes her, she likes him, even though they're professional, she's still got to do her job. So there's ways to ask difficult questions. And the person can always refuse it.
Right.
Yeah.
And you often, depending on how much time you have, you don't start with why did you cheat on your wife? question, right? I mean, you kind of ease into those.
Exactly.
And you, as Alicia
build
just
a
said,
rapport.
you build a rapport.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can ask. And then, then they kind of look like, what? I thought we were friends.
Right. And particularly when you're broadcast. And it's important, that's why it's important to be professional, and yet you're going to be friendly, but you are not friends.
Absolutely.
So you have to be clear on that border. It's a very fine line to walk. And, we can talk later about different ways to do that. But, particularly on broadcast, I mean, I don't know if you all have seen like Katie Couric and asking Sarah Palin about the new media, that she read and the elections, during election season, and that changes the course of how people perceive you. So particularly when you're asking questions that people might not feel comfortable with. I mean, that was a benign question in that case to a lot of people would consider that a benign question. On camera, it shows something different too. Absolutely. So it's something to be aware of. I'm going to move through quickly. Here is someone who was famous but newly famous. Nina Davuluri was the first Indian American Miss America. And she told me something she hadn't told anybody else, which she was engaged. She talked about just in terms of how some, Indians from India viewed her. She's a browner skinned Indian American woman, and how, there was a lot of talk within the South Asian community about how she wouldn't have been elected as a beauty queen within India. So it's kind of interesting that she would hear. And so, I asked her about that, and, that came from a maybe insider cultural knowledge that I didn't necessarily have, but I have enough friends that are South Asian and was connected enough to the different blogs that are geared toward the community to try to delicately ask that. And she, also spoke for the first time about who she was engaged to, and why she was engaged to him, and talked very, candidly about, him being a white guy and what issues that brought up with her family. And that wasn't something she had told anybody before. So it broke a little news and got a gazillion hits. This is just a piece. I was doing a series, we always have these kind of every month, there's Native American History Month, Black History Month, Latino History Month, Asian American, etc. So I was I'm sick of all this history you don't know. So how do we have a forward-thinking way? And so I was talking to a lot of my sources. This happened to be a lawyer at Michigan, Martha Jones, who I talked to for legal issues. And just in keeping, in touch with context, she was like, yeah, I have this story, but it's nothing. You know, I was like, oh, what's the story? Talk to me.
Those are the
so
best.
I don't, right, of course.
Yeah.
So these are the things that you know, not counting on. So she tells this very personal story about how she grew up. Her mother was white, her father was black. You know, she had a very, her black grandmother was very strong presence in like defining her identity. And she kind of admits in coming out as biracial because she always so strongly identified as being black that it wasn't until her students who were kind of, you know, freely identifying as biracial and claiming all, you know, all their hair, you know, all their different heritage that she was like, okay, maybe I'll go ahead and come out of the closet. So it was this interesting, very personal story. And it was further, I think, nuanced because she's a lawyer. And so she knows the legal implications and why people, it's the one drop rule, you know, in American society and what that meant and kind of claiming black identity, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this piece, I mean, it has a really compelling photo gallery, like 10 million page views. I mean, it was like people were eating this up and it was just a personal story that she kind of threw aside when I was just kind of keeping in touch with her. So that came from just an interview. And lastly, I will show this video. This is a short broadcast piece. Marcus Samuelsson's kind of a celebrity chef who was opening. This is part of that How I Got Here series I mentioned. And so hopefully an ad won't run, and it might. I'm just going to mute that for a second. So he's a celebrity chef, and he was opening a new like Harlem restaurant. This is his first kind of, I mean, he had worked at Aquavit, this kind of like well-established restaurant in New York City. And so he was opening this in Harlem. It was getting all this press.
He's handsome.
And he is attractive. He's married. And so he was just telling this story about, you know, his own personal journey. So he was one of the people who was featured in this story that we'll hear now.
I'm Marcus Samuelsson, chef and co-owner of Red Rooster Harlem. Can't tell you how excited we're all about tonight. We've been working on this for a year. But it's really about pacing. I always knew I wanted to open a restaurant in Harlem, but sort of cooking for the president and winning Top Chef Master really gave me the confidence to say, hey, maybe I can stretch this and put my restaurant in Harlem. I always have fear in things, but I can't even wake up and think about it like that. I think the fear is in not doing. If I don't do it, who will? If you're a chef in New York City, fear cannot drive you, then you're in the wrong city. Through businesses, you can take care of the corner, you can create jobs. And that's what we do.
Good job, and it's a wonderful restaurant.
Congratulations! Congratulations.
Red Rooster was a restaurant that was opened in the late 30s and 40s. A lot of black professionals used to come there, but also the regular guy. And it was important to open something that the old generation in Harlem felt connected to, but yet do a new version of that. The food at Red Rooster is based in American comfort food. And I also have other layers to add to that. I have my Swedish experience that I grew up on, and I have a little bit of African experience that I grew up on. Well, I also want to introduce and showcase the full narrative of Harlem, which is obviously largely African American, but it's also white, it's also Jewish, it's also Latin, really changing the footprint of dining a little bit. I think this is what I meant to do, to cook in Harlem right now. I mean, Harlem has always been the center of black culture, and I think it's ready to have this hopefully amazing restaurant that we're trying to do. I'm really asking people, saying, hey, do you want to join me on this journey and come to Harlem? When people come to New York, when people come to Harlem, and get in and taste us and experience us. And say, hey, Harlem was yummy. Harlem was fun.
All right,
Nice.
so
Cool.
I mean, that's a little taste of what I've done and what I do, and we want to really give you guys the opportunity to practice your skills for the art of the interview before we kind of transition into kind of the more hands-on portion of our workshop. Do you all have any questions about us or what we've talked about? We'll get a chance to talk more about this at the end, but give you a chance now.
Yeah, absolutely. Please say your name.
I'm Vera
Hi,
from
Vera.
Bowdoin Orient.
From where?
Bowdoin Orient.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
And the news writer right now. I feel like you two both touched on like how to deal with difficult scenarios with different people. I just wonder, like, how would you have a conversation with an administrator who is very reserved, or say, like talk to some random students to kind of have a sense like how the student body reacts to certain things, but because that is so political and sensitive that
Right.
people don't want to talk about.
Yeah, I
How do you
mean,
deal with that?
I think it's always a delicate dance to when you're dealing with an issue that may be sensitive or controversial. But I think what you have to do is just kind of pick it off one at a time. So you have a number of questions that you know that you need asked for your story. And you have to know the right people to go to. And then you make the call. You tell them what you're doing. You tell them that you're writing a story on X, Y, or Z. And then you say, I really need to talk to you. And so then that person would say, what? I don't want to talk? Or
Like for
What-
example, like last week I was covering something about student activism,
Mhm.
and they're just like, we are apolitical and we don't want to talk about this.
the administrators?
It's a student organization,
Oh, the student,
which
okay, the
like
organization.
most people think they are supposed to take a stance
Right.
on that stuff.
So were you writing it specifically about this organization? What
Not
you were
really,
writing?
it's just like how they react to the petition another organization is doing.
But I'm wondering, is there anybody else you could talk to? So if you couldn't get to that one organization, is there somebody else who could comment on the same?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's difficult because there are sometimes there's a topic and sometimes a group the head of the group has said to its members, do not talk to the press, right? I mean, so you've been kind of shut out. But if you still, I mean, our job is to try to find a way in, and it may not be through that group, but it may be through a similar group. Or there are other people who can comment. I mean, people who actually, maybe they're stakeholders in some way and who actually know the topic. But we cannot allow people, because if they stonewall, or if they're evasive or just won't talk to us. For example, the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, is known for not talking to the press. I mean, outside of when he's standing at the podium and talking to people. So he doesn't typically, he will not engage in a press conference in which there's give and take. But we still have to get that information.
One thing I might suggest too, if I can add on, is if it's an apolitical organization, and rightly so. I mean, I've done this with Pew. They're not going to comment on like the specific numbers. They're providing like the statistics. Let's say is you can say, you know what, I can appreciate you not wanting to share an opinion about this, but you're an organization that does X, Y, or Z. Can you provide some facts? You know what I mean, for this story? And then like Don said. There's always going to be some activists. There's always going to be someone who wants to share their opinion. Trust me, it's just your job to find that. But I think that this is where you get a chance to kind of like reach out to groups and reach out and find people within that will speak on it, and that's where the persistence really pays off.
Right.
Can you also talk about how you deal with the mayor thing?
The mayor?
How do you get him talking?
Yeah, I have, I'll call the mayor's PR person, and then we'll do that same, I mean, the persistence where it's like, no, I can't talk to anybody else. I need to talk to him directly. I need a comment from him directly. And if it's on deadline, it's a little bit more of a challenge because they can wait you out, right? But and a lot of the stories that I write really are more long-term, so I can wait him out. And I can go to where I know he's going to be. And I mean, there have been times when the mayor has slipped out of a back door, and not just in avoiding me, but to avoid a number of people. But it is a matter of persistence. You just have to keep going with it. And it's sometimes it's just about the clock, right. And do you have time? How much time do you have? There have been occasions. I mean, I have a colleague here who just finished a story. And the Chicago Public Schools, I mean, the organization was stonewalling them, And then when they decided to give him the documents that he needed, they did a big document dump, meaning, I mean, they released reams and reams of files. And what they told him to do, pretty much, was you need to sift through all this stuff, and then, and then the numbers are in there, but find it. Mm-hmm. And that's also a strategy that sucks. But luckily, he and his colleague had the time to go through the documents. And then what you do is you go through them, and then you go back to the source and say, okay, I need you to comment on X. I mean, why is this so messed up? Or why are these numbers, why don't they make sense? So, but it is, I mean, these are stalling techniques that people will employ. And depending on, and then you get to talk to your editor, and then they will, that editor, that person, and maybe that person and someone else can decide whether do you hold the story for this? I mean, is this a piece that acts kind of like a linchpin for the story that you really, really need? Or is it something that you can say in the story, we tried to deal with this entity, but they wouldn't cooperate, and then work around it.
So we're going to actually, we're going to take some more questions at the end, but we really want to get you guys jumping in and practicing the art of the interview yourselves with some of the techniques and some of the things we talked about. So we are going to ask you to pair in two. Just look at the person next to you. Hopefully it's not someone you know, so you get to know someone new. And, kind of, spread out in the room.
So we're going to have like a group over here.